Okay, welcome everyone. Welcome back. For those of you who are just joining us, and everyone who's returning from the previous session, welcome back. My name is Derek Wilmot. I am your. I'll be the moderator for this session, and our chat monitor is Julie Winkelstein, and our Q&A navigator this time is Rachel Rosekind. Welcome to the next session of the Abolitionist Visions and Intersections, as a summit hosted by the American Library Association Social Responsibilities Roundtable, or SRRT. SRRT believes that libraries and librarians must center social responsibility by recognizing and helping to solve social problems and inequities to work for the common good. To enable captions, click More in the bottom right of the screen, then click Show Captions. Our session today will be recorded, and the recording will be available via the SRRT website by early April. Please keep your cameras and mics off, and unless you are a presenter, please be respectful and extend care and compassion to yourself and others. This includes using person-first language when posing questions or sharing information in the chat. Please refrain from using dehumanizing language such as prisoner, convict, or ex-con, and instead use language which emphasizes the personhood of these populations, such as incarcerated person, justice-involved individual, or just impacted person, for example. These sessions focus on whose knowledge, whose archives, and we are joined by Emily Benoff speaking on We Want Freedom, an abolitionist methodology for stewarding personal records created by incarcerated people in university libraries. Full bios of all our speakers are going to be available on our website. Use the Q&A feature to pose questions and reserve the chat to relay any technical issues, resource share-outs, or appreciation for our panelists. We hope to have our brief Q&A, a brief window for a Q&A at the end. If you do not get to pose your question live, we encourage you to reach out to the presenter if they have shared contact or organizational information in the chat. And with that, I'm going to turn this over to Emily. Thank you. And Emily, I think you're.
I'm so sorry. I was
No,
muted.
you're fine. You're fine. I didn't know if you were muted or not.
I'm so sorry. Can everyone see my screen?
Yes, we can.
Okay, great. So hello. Thank you so much for the opportunity to share my thoughts among like-minded librarians, activists, and archivists. Today I'll be offering an abolitionist methodology for stewarding personal records created by incarcerated people in university libraries and archives. So to briefly summarize the issue I'll be discussing in my presentation, when university libraries and archives acquire personal records created by incarcerated people, they sever these records from the key regional, political, and affective contexts that most fully activate their evidentiary value. To mitigate harm, an abolitionist methodology for stewarding such collections in university archives and libraries would center the epistemic and archival autonomy of all record co-creators, linking them to their records through participatory and place-based archival practices.
Excuse me, Emily. We're only able to see like a portion of your screen there for some reason.
Oh, that's so weird. Okay. One moment then. Better?
Yes, perfect.
Okay, great. Awesome. So in this presentation, I will first contextualize the growing relevance of personal records created by incarcerated people in university libraries and archives. I will then surface the ways that university repositories are currently ill-equipped to ethically collect incarcerated personal records and assess the applicability of several pre-existing LIS frameworks for university archivists engaged in this sort of collecting. And finally, I will offer some solutions to the issue in the form of a preliminary abolitionist methodology for stewarding these records in university settings. As prison activism and abolitionist appeals permeate popular discourse, the study and documentation of mass incarceration has seen an encouraging paradigm shift that challenges the erasure of the embodied prison experience. Humanities scholars, human rights organizations, and activists have all deviated from a sole reliance on more quantitative research methods that utilize official state records. And through a turn to qualitative research, these stakeholders amplify incarcerated voices by prioritizing documentary evidence of incarcerated people's first-person experiences. Responding to this trend and to the now ubiquitous social justice rhetoric that animates the LIS imagination, universities and higher education nonprofits have begun to acquire personal records created by incarcerated people. As the primary case study for my MLIS thesis research, from which this presentation is adapted, I specifically focused on Brown University's 2022 acquisition of the Mumia Abu-Jamal papers as part of its new Voices of Mass Incarceration in the United States collecting focus. Though the trend of incarcerated record collecting has certainly gained prevalence within the past 5 or so years, the LIS profession as a whole has failed to adequately probe its ethical and methodological implications. And absent such discourse, university libraries have the potential to do more harm than good when engaging with currently incarcerated people's personal records. This potential harm is in part due to the fact that there are various structural issues rendering current library and archival infrastructures incommensurable with personal records created by incarcerated people. First, and this is very obvious, is that universities contain administrative and repressive infrastructures like those of the state. So ABLA Ivy Plus, a group of abolitionist librarians and archivists from Ivy Plus universities, note how university libraries whitewash their ties to policing, surveillance, and the prison industrial complex, and the ways their practices have internalized carceral logics. So how can we reconcile stewarding incarcerated personal papers in institutions so deeply invested in maintaining the very carceral systems that disenfranchise the record creators whose histories we are trying to preserve? Second, university archives enclose incarcerated people's personal records within the public archives tradition and its fetishization of undifferentiated public access. So most university repositories conceive of the public as a homogeneous entity to which their accessibility protocols are universally obliged. But incarcerated people are already subject to forced visibility. For example, through Hudson versus Palmer, which is a court ruling that limits incarcerated people's right to privacy in their cells, and the USA Patriot Act, which has utilized record subpoenas to further criminalize already vulnerable people. And this is not to mention, as Yesenia just discussed, the multiply situated surveillance mechanisms targeted against marginalized or otherwise vulnerable communities on the outside. The public archives tradition fails to consider the necessity for counter strategies of invisibility, or what archivist J.J. Goddard calls oblivion, as an active resistance against state domination. Finally, though university archives and libraries claim to be open to all, they undeniably prioritize academics and students at the expense of all other user groups. Not only does the use of criminal records in college admissions pose barriers for record creators and their communities to become the target users of their own records, but the emphasis on scholarly activation of these records engenders a false dichotomy between the incarcerated and the academic. Through this logic, university archives who collect incarcerated people's records can serve to transfer incarcerated knowledge from the prison to a prison-like repository. To begin addressing these structural issues, I'll assess 3 archival frameworks advanced by contemporary LIS and archival studies scholarship that I feel to be especially fruitful for university archives collecting incarcerated people's personal records. After briefly summarizing each framework, I'll illuminate both the features that university archivists ought to apply to ensure the epistemic and archival autonomy of incarcerated record creators and their communities, and the features of the frameworks that have not yet gone far enough. Tanya Sutherland and Damian M. Sojourner offer the most astute frames of reference for the predatory relationship between the carceral state and the archives, and archives can be extended to the entire LIS infrastructure and community. Sutherland proposes 2 helpful conceptualizations of archival collections and their activations: the carceral archives and the carceral archive. So for Sutherland, the defining characteristic of the carceral archives is that they comprise records or collections of records held by institutions and that one or both work in service of oppressive state powers. Sutherland traces a continuous path from dominant archival practice to carceral imaginaries by highlighting how LIS professionals concretize singular interpretations of records through archival storytelling to construct these normative ideals against which racialized bodies can be measured. Her carceral archive extends beyond the actually existing carceral archives to include damaging narratives that trap marginalized people in what she calls an embodied carceral reality. Developing Sutherland's vision, Sojourner proposes an antidote to the carceral archive, what he calls a fugitive archival practice that centers communal knowledge sharing via the archives to inform the possibility of multiple ways of being. Taken together, carceral archives and fugitive archives comprise one beneficial framework for university archivists engaged in incarcerated collecting because it outlines an anti-carceral criteria against which archivists and librarians can evaluate their practices in relation to lived carceral outcomes. However, carceral archives often focus wholly on records produced by the state without responding to the unique ontological or epistemic status of first-person carceral narratives produced on the inside. And also, this framework seems to be overly theoretical, and it offers little implementable recommendations for translating theory to praxis. Activist archives constitute a second framework with potential for university archivists and librarians stewarding personal records created by incarcerated people. Archivist Andrew Flynn provides a helpful definition of activist archives as those driven more by a political agenda in which the preservation and use of historical materials might play a role in serving a set of political aims. Because mass incarceration is obviously a highly political mechanism of control, its growing relevance in university archives demonstrates how activist archives can penetrate institutional boundaries. Proponents of the activist framework similarly illustrate how even more traditional archives and archival materials can serve as valuable resources for activist projects if archivists can only expand their target users to include everyday activists and advocates. Forcing archivists to look inward, Joanne Evans et al. Introduced the concept of archival and epistemic autonomy as a form of archival activism for the self-determination and empowerment of record co-creators. Through this lens, resource sharing, and outreach are activist activities that university archives can and must take to allow record creators to become the participatory agents in their own record keeping. The activist framework is productive for university archivists collecting incarcerated records, firstly because it dismisses the misconception that LIS work is a neutral act, and instead foregrounds grassroots knowledge production as a form of activist labor from which archivists must learn. It also encourages university archivists to see archiving as a gesture toward futurity rather than a mere representation of the past. And this opens the possibility for archivists to use their power to imagine a more just world and to develop new frameworks for assessing archival literacy and learning outcomes that align with this goal. However, the activist framework is not comprehensive enough to fully address incarcerated collecting because it does not address the surveillance risks associated with activist work in a prison-like repository, such as the university. It doesn't address the history of university repression on campus, or the differing literacies and experiences non-student or non-traditional users and impacted communities might bring to their research. And finally, the human rights framework is possibly the most poignant framework with the potential to inform university archives incarcerated collecting. First, human rights archives often focus on informal or unofficial documentary evidence for which the provenance or chain of custody may be unclear. And this is especially true for personal records created by incarcerated people, whose documentary actions are often carried out under crisis and whose ownership rights and archival or epistemic autonomy are limited. Personal records often leave prison walls out of necessity, not out of choice, and creators cannot control how their materials circulate on the outside. Human rights frameworks, therefore, recognize how traditional notions of provenance and its attribution of creatorship to donors or accumulating agents, rather than creators or source communities, can cause harm to marginalized communities. They instead advance the notion of parallel provenance, which acknowledges the coexistence of multiple record creators simultaneously and offers rights and records to all co-creators implicated by this expanded provenance scope. Finally, human rights archives adopt participatory models that employ decentralized curation, radical user orientation, and parallel contextualization. If enforced by university LIS professionals, the human rights framework would beneficially stimulate archivists to situate mass incarceration as a form of human rights abuse and place American human rights violations in this way within the context of state-sponsored violence internationally. The framework is also beneficial because it visibilizes multiply situated rights and records and the fluidity of communities both victimizing and perpetrating violence. However, as archivist Mario H. Ramirez reminds us, the human rights discourse is not good enough because human rights discourse that constitutes the human rights archival framework is defined by the very nation or state powers from which incarcerated people and their communities might be seeking protection. So, synthesizing the most constructive elements of the three frameworks I just addressed, I will now propose a multifaceted abolitionist methodology for stewarding incarcerated people's personal records in university archives. I do want to clarify that this methodology is necessarily partial without the direct participation of currently incarcerated people and their communities. And so it's definitely not my intention to offer any prescripted advice for incarcerated record stewardship. Instead, my goal is just to open up the conversation for further consideration and action on a topic that I believe to be kind of underrepresented within the current discourse. So, considering the paucity of LIS theory attending to the stewardship of incarcerated records, I first recommend that university librarians and archivists employ theory building as an abolitionist methodology through which to foreground both lived experience of and empirical knowledge about incarceration in the development of archival expertise. Theory building as an abolitionist intervention can include university archivists forming relationships with faculty already engaged in participatory action research or prison education projects to develop feasible approaches to inside-outside collaboration with incarcerated record creators. It could also include continuing to form interinstitutional working groups and establishing free conferences and journals such as this one in service of abolitionist theory building. And I propose that university archivists utilize abolitionist networks already formed by the Abolitionist Library Association and the countless abolitionist organizations who are already doing this work as a starting point for this process. By doing this, we can begin to decenter the professionalization and supposed authority of the LIS field when it comes to stewarding these sorts of records. An abolitionist methodology for stewarding incarcerated records must also work toward increased transparency about the explanation of the transfer of ownership or custody of the records from the creator or custodian to the archival institution. University archivists often center the collection's donor in the story it tells the public about the acquisition of incarcerated collections. But this obscures the fact that these records initially cross prison borders due to oppressive systems that restrict the types and amounts of personal materials incarcerated people can store in their cells. University archivists must be explicit about how state-sponsored forced appraisal mediates the collections before they even enter the archives, and they must identify any controversial or extractive acquisition circumstances in the custodial or acquisition history finding aid fields and in collection level descriptions. Next, knowing that incarcerated people are often removed from their communities and sent to rural prisons far from home, and that carcerality is a state-driven local issue in a lot of ways, university archivists should better preserve the integrity of a record or incarcerated creator's geographic origin as a critical element of its provenance. And this could include preserving the integrity of the prison cell as an aspect of provenance too. So an abolitionist methodology could heed the example set by Brown University, which relocated the Mumia Abu Jamal collection from Philadelphia to Rhode Island by funding trips for Philadelphia public school students to visit the collection in person. But the abolitionist methodology ideally would go even further, and it would keep collections and institutions local to the incarcerated creators' source community to continue or to ensure continued accessibility and use by those who are closest impacted by the activities evidenced by the records. A methodology would also require university archivists to shift from prison-centric to survivor-centric descriptive language and develop local controlled vocabularies utilizing participatory methods and crowdsourcing techniques that are rooted in activist wisdom and co-creator community knowledge. I'm sure people that have relied on Library of Congress subject headings or other sort of like internationally recognized controlled vocabularies know how insufficient these vocabularies are in representing, these types of materials. So accordingly, an abolitionist methodology obliges university archivists to employ CMS infrastructures, content management system infrastructures with the capacity to visibilize both incarcerated records' parallel provenance and the participatory knowledge of co-creators. So for example, the CMS Mukrutu, which you can see a snapshot here on the screen, can help support participatory practices by allowing representatives from incarcerated and co-creator communities to edit resources, add content, and make access decisions on their own terms. And also, as you can see on the screen, the CMS allows users to simultaneously view the institutional and community-generated record, kind of layered on top of each other. And it allows the source communities to provide differentiated access depending on specific user groups. And finally, an abolitionist methodology would require university archivists to take into account the multiply situated privacy and surveillance vulnerabilities of record co-creators, whether people on the inside or their communities on the outside, and to mobilize their collective power to advocate for divestment from police and prison labor in universities. And that is it. Thank you for your time.
Okay, welcome back. We had a second session, our presentation for this session, but that person is not here yet. So if we'd like, we can go into Q&A if you're all right with that, Emily.
Sure.
Thank you. Sorry to put you on the spot. If there's any questions, please use the Q&A feature in the lower left-hand side of your screen there. Comments are coming up on the right there. Great presentation. Thank you, Emily. Most excellent.
Someone is actually also asking if Emily wouldn't mind sharing the slides.
Oh, I missed that one. Okay, thank you, Rachel.
I can pass them along to maybe Rachel. She can circulate.
Yeah, I'd be glad to. I already have them, but I just wanted your permission.
Yeah, you do. Yeah, sure. Yeah.
Okay, so in that case, does anyone have any questions that they'd like to ask Emily at this point? And floor is open. Really quick, sorry. Because if they don't, I might have some too.
Derek, we have a raised hand, Tristan Gordon.
Oh, sure. Well, if you'd like to, let's see. I went by too quickly. I didn't see it. If you'd like to, yes, Tristan, if you'd like to go ahead and ask your question.
Hi there. Yeah, I couldn't type my question quickly enough, but I guess I was curious if you've come across any projects that you feel are equipping. It seemed like one of the things was maybe moving away from university-based archives if possible. I mean, recognizing that those are institutions that hold a lot of, you know, have a lot of the resources to do some of the archival work, but some of the recommendations that you're making seem like would be best fitted for more kind of grassroots archival practices, like smaller archives. And I'm curious if that has factored into any of your research or ways of kind of supporting that kind of work or knowledge transfer of archival practices to communities that could be doing that work themselves. Hopefully that made sense.
Yeah, thanks, Tristan. No, 100%. Like, I think when I first learned about the Mumia Abu Jamal collection being acquired by Brown, my first reaction was like, yeah, this should not, this shouldn't be there. Why should these records be in university archives to begin with? And then the more that I thought about it, the more that I kind of like framed the presentation and the research around, well, it already is there. Like, these things are happening. And so we're not going to necessarily, we can advocate for stopping university archives acquiring these things, but if it's already there, then how do we sort of address the exchange, as you're saying, the exchange of knowledge from more community-based archival infrastructures into the universities without being extractive, which is a very complicated topic. But in terms of like different projects, I've worked with the Skid Row History Museum and Archive. I'm based in LA. And they're a community-based archive that documents the activist and artistic history of the Skid Row community. And they are completely community-based, mostly volunteer-run, and mostly community-led. And so I find that a lot of their practices are kind of like inspiration for what I would hope to see in this abolitionist methodology. And also, I've worked a little bit with the Texas After Violence Project. I'm sure, I don't know, maybe people have heard of this organization. It's also a community-based sort of digital archive that conducts oral histories of people who've been impacted by the criminal justice system. Oh yeah, Texas After Violence, presenting tomorrow. Yeah, they're so amazing. And I've had the opportunity not only to work with them, but to talk to some people that work there. And I've learned that they have a lot of really interesting approaches. Like, for example, they've been able to like code themselves as a journalistic entity so that they can actually enter the prisons themselves and have this like inside-outside collaboration. And this is a very like legal technical thing that they were able to do this, but also they will never collect records of currently incarcerated people. And I think that's probably a good start. And so they're definitely like it. I feel like university archives like want people to think that they're like the pioneers of like doing this work. But I think like what I was trying to get at is there's like a whole underbelly of these more sort of like fugitive, community-led practices that have been doing the work for, generations. And so we should be able to learn more from them. Yeah. Hope that answers part of your question.
So I had one that came through the chat. I'll put that one up first, since it's already passed, is what can we do to further the cause?
I mean, I think at this point it's just awareness. Like, I think, which is like, I don't know, maybe like a little bit of a cop out, but it's just so like in the beginning stages. I think rather than like the phrase vocational awe, like we do these things, like we are sort of like flawless in a way, like we as in the LIS community. I feel like the first step is to sort of just like break that, deconstruct that, and realize that the people, like currently incarcerated people, and not to say that everyone doesn't realize that, but these people are intellectuals, these people are advocates, these people are scholars in a lot of different ways. And so this sort of like, the labor of collecting the records, the labor of like creating these records is extremely risky for currently incarcerated people. And to have the knowledge kind of go to the outside and for university archivists or scholars or whatever to be like, okay, well, I'm going to take this and I'm going to create the theory based off of, this information. That, as I said in the presentation, it just creates this false dichotomy between, the expert and the incarcerated. And I think the first step is to just recognize that that's what's happening. And then as I said, just to continue to, advance like decarceral policies in your university. Libraries often rely on incarcerated labor, as we all, I'm sure, know. So just like even, paying like who's getting paid for these donations? Like, is it the donor or is it the family of the incarcerated person? I feel like there's a lot of things like every step of the way that people can sort of just like critically think about. These collections are different from other collections that universities might steward.
Thank you. We have another one in the Q&A. Do you have any thoughts about the role that funding agencies play in this ecosystem of directing incarcerated people's records to universities? For example, several of the projects you referenced are funded by Mellon Foundation.
Yeah, I mean, true, fair. There's definitely a paradox there. I I mean, the whole nonprofit industrial complex is like its own thing that we can talk about, and I hope someone does that knows a little bit more about it than I do. But I think that's one of the reasons why the university archival infrastructures and library infrastructures are so sort of like bound to these particular thought processes that are carceral in nature. So yeah, funding definitely has a negative impact in my personal opinion. I know that I was talking to somebody at Brown who was saying that a lot of the archives in Philadelphia, the university archives in Philadelphia, they didn't want to take these papers because of resource constraints, and so these place-based, I guess ideas that I had in mind aren't possible because of funding in some ways. And so I don't have a necessarily an answer for you, but I completely agree that that's something we need to address as a field.
All right, we have another one from Ray James. How do university archivists learn about materials from incarcerated people? So turn that over to you as well.
Well, from the examples that I found, like for example, I mentioned Brown was like a case study. And so Joanna Hernandez, I think she's a scholar. She graduated from Brown. She teaches now at, I think, a CUNY or something like that. And she got Mumia's papers. Well, I guess he kind of like gave them to her for safekeeping when he was taken off of death row and transferred cells and told like he couldn't have the stuff in his cell anymore. And they found out about it through Joanna's advocacy. So she came to Brown, or she came to different universities. So I think it's kind of like that. Or I know that like some universities, like the Johns Hopkins, the prison writing archive, which started, I think, at another school, a small liberal arts school, Hamilton or something like that. Anyway, they have some sort of relationship with the institution, with the prison institution. But I do think for the most part, it is like centering the donor. The donor has these papers, they want them somewhere. And I know like in Brown's, a lot of their literature on the collection, they have about Mumia, but then they have about Joanna as well. And so it kind of is like the person on the outside who has these papers is the one who has the autonomy to like try to place them in the archive. And I think there was on prison radio, Mumia actually said like he wasn't mad about the placement, but he didn't know about it in advance. And so that kind of just shows like they don't learn about it. It's not like people on the inside are like, let me give my papers to Brown University or something like that. So I think there's issues with that kind of process.
Along that same line, what are some of the other challenges that you may have that you've had to work around when you've with this type of work?
I think, it's a good question. I mean, I feel like honestly, just number one, the university infrastructures that I mentioned before, it's like I'm just a person. I'm not gonna like change how university archives and not just me, but like everyone who's doing this work. It's like it's tough to sort of change how archival infrastructures have been going for generations and generations. So that's been tough. and talking to university archivists, talking to archivists in general who are like extremely like sympathetic, like we have similar like, oh, there's something wrong here, but the fact that everyone's so kind of like tied up, like there's no funding, people are working like project-based, like precarious labor, people don't have the capacity in their workplace a lot of times to kind of like challenge systemic practices. That's an issue. Also, just the whole notion of like trying, and I'm sure I have not succeeded in this front completely, but trying to, you know, like integrate these community-based or these like sort of grassroots like activist wisdoms without kind of being extractive. I think that's a really big challenge when it comes to like not like helicopter research or whatever. Like how do you sustain these relationships, especially when university archives are not trusted by people on the outside a lot of times. And so I think all of these things are not just something that I struggle with, but something that a lot of archivists, I'm sure, struggle with in their social justice work.
All right. Well, I'm not seeing any more questions at the moment, so if anyone has one, please feel free to put it either in the chat or in the Q&A. Somebody commented, I'm disappointed and wonder why Mumia, I'm not saying that right, I'm sure, was not consulted about giving his archive to Brown University.
I can find the prison radio segment about that and try to send that to Rachel to circulate, because it will take me a second to find it, but it's pretty interesting to read. Not to say, and as again, I'm not trying to argue that he was mad about it or anything like that, but just the whole consent aspect of it.
Right. Well, thank you. It's been very enlightening. Thank you very much. Let's see if we have any other questions or anything. Do you have any suggestions or, oh, there's another one that did pop up. Do you have suggestions and or suggested resources for descriptive practices around incarcerated writers and people?
Oh my gosh. Yes. There's I'm looking this up right now. I'm gonna forget the name, but it's like the Philadelphia Anti-Racist Descriptive Framework. There's in Philadelphia, a group of Black archivists created a really helpful, not a controlled vocabulary, but like a set of guidelines for this type of stuff. And there's many other ones. I'll link them in the for Rachel to have, just because I can't think of them off the top of my head. But
That would
they're
be great. We can put them on our
resource.
webpage for that as well, for
Sure,
everybody
sure.
to
Yeah.
access later. And it'll stay there for a long, long time.
If anyone else has any, because I'm not, you know, an expert, please share.
All right. And oh, there we go. Just where comments are coming in. Let's see. Okay. Just watching along here for a second. So with that, I think we'll probably conclude for a little bit, give you a bit of a break. Emily, thank you so much. I know that we've got a few more, we're gonna have a pretty big delay here. So what we can either do, as all of us are here having to work with Zoom and everything else, I'm sure we've all been to these types of summits where things don't always work out at best, but we roll along. So, and our next session is supposed to be at the, let's see, at the 25, sorry, I'm trying to look at my notes here. This session ends at 1:20, and then about 10 minutes after that, so 1:30 will be the next one after that. What we can do is we can either open this session up for just some feedback, or we can go ahead and just give everybody a break to stretch and then come back. This Zoom window will still remain open, and our next session is institution education and intellectual engagement. And just come back to this room. It'll stay open until that time. So we encourage you to stick around if you have time. Thank you.